Hi, sleeping for hours family. Before you sleep, please subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our nightly videos.
Tonight we meet Willie Moretti, the North Jersey fixer whose handshake booked singers, whose jokes rattled senators on live TV, and whose name flashed across front pages. We're not here to glorify wrongdoing, but to understand an era. From prohibition backroads to neon supper clubs, he turned connections into currency and shaped music, politics, and nightlife. Get cozy, breathe slow, and let the lights dim. In the next moments, we'll untangle facts, rumors, and consequences around a man who made a city's nights run. He came from the old world like many did, a child from an Italian port city whose family sought steadier work across the ocean. The tenements and shop fronts of New York and New Jersey offered little comfort, but they offered a path if you could move quickly. He learned English in hallways and on stoops, learned when to speak and when to keep quiet, learned who to greet and who to avoid. Street life taught a code before any school did. He picked up odd jobs, carried crates, pushed a broom, ran errands for men who wore good suits and kept their voices low. He was friendly and funny, a cut-up even then, and people remembered his face. He kept his hair neat, dressed sharp when he could, and looked like he belonged wherever he stood. As he grew into his 20s, a new law turned the night upside down. Prohibition arrived, and what had been a drink at the end of a long day became a secret ceremony. The ban didn't stop demand, it made a market. In that market, strong nerves and a steady smile counted as much as muscle. He got involved early, according to police memoranda and old indictments. He ran liquor, arranged safe storage, and lined up drivers who knew the roads through Bergen and Passaic. He didn't see himself as a bruiser. He saw himself as a broker, a man who could take a mess of moving parts and make the whole thing hum. He had a knack for the right introduction, and he understood that in a business built on silence, a warm hello had its own kind of force. By the mid-1920s, he was known on both sides of the Hudson. He made friends with men whose names would later fill headline columns. Joe Adonis, who handled beauty parlors by day and heavy work by night. Frank Costello, a smooth operator who liked politics and calm rooms. Obner Long Zwilman, the Newark powerhouse, who ran his partnerships like a businessman. New Jersey needed a connector, someone who could keep roadhouse owners happy, keep payments on schedule, and soothe quarrels before they took a bad turn. Willie fit that part. He could talk without making enemies, and that made him valuable. He preferred a table where everyone left smiling to a showdown, and he had the gift of making that happen. Prohibition was his on-ramp. He developed relationships with speakeasy owners and truck suppliers, gave quiet assurances to local officials who wanted trouble kept off their blocks, and gathered a circle of reliable middlemen. He also learned the hazards. Police raids came. Cars were seized. Cases were filed. Arrest records from that era tie him to liquor violations and related charges in New Jersey and New York. He picked up fines, faced hearings, and hired lawyers who knew every wrinkle in the code. The pattern took shape. He avoided flashy violence, kept his voice even, and settled issues through meetings, not messes. When the 18th Amendment fell and legal drinking returned, he didn't vanish. It pivoted. Gambling, bookmaking, the numbers, cards, and dice was where he sank roots after repeal. If you wanted to place a bet on a horse at Belmont or a ball game, there were phones to call, parlors to visit, and runners to meet. And behind those moving parts were men like him who made sure money moved cleanly. Police blotters and contemporary news articles frequently name him as a central figure in North Jersey wagering. He was tied to bookmaking rings that stretched across counties, with wire rooms hidden behind storefronts and lookout systems that signaled trouble blocks away. Arrests continued, often for gambling conspiracies or running illegal games, and yet the penalties rarely held him long. He kept a lawyer on retainer, posted bond quickly, and went back to his routine. A photograph here, a courtroom visit there, a shrug, a grin, and back to the phone calls. His world overlapped with show business. Musicians, comics, and crooners worked the same nightlife economy that kept the betting alive. He liked that world. He liked the glow of a bandstand, the laughter from a table where the joke finally landed, the applause. Clubs in Bergen and Hudson counties knew him on sight. He supplied credit to owners, arranged security when they hosted a big act, and made sure out-of-town performers found a friendly face. Newspaper clippings and memoirs place him at popular roadhouses, including the rustic cabin in Englewood Cliffs, where the band played to a radio audience and young singers tried to get noticed. That was how the lines between entertainment and rackets blurred. If you ran the night, you knew the talent. And if you knew the talent, you could open doors. His social gift helped him climb. After Luciano's deportation in the mid-1940s, Frank Costello held sway over a major New York organization, and New Jersey was its backyard. By many accounts in law enforcement files and later histories, Willie functioned as Costello's key lieutenant across the river, managing crews, smoothing ties with other operators, and keeping revenue steady. Some sources go further and call him underboss during that era. Titles in that world were flexible, but the reach was clear. When Jersey wanted a decision, he was often in the room. He preferred to build consensus. Where another man might slam a fist, he ordered lunch and made a joke. The point was the same. Keep business moving, keep the peace, keep everyone paid. With influence came more responsibility and more risk. Fixing disputes meant navigating contracts for singers and band leaders, smoothing problems between rival bookmakers, and addressing what the press called protection for club owners who didn't want the wrong trouble walking through their door. Allegations of extortion appeared alongside gambling charges in some filings, though or else they were pleaded down to lesser counts. He also faced tax inquiries. Revenue agents in that period targeted underworld figures whose spending didn't match reported income, and he was no exception. A paper trail from those years shows investigations into his earnings and assets, though serious penalties proved elusive for a long stretch. The story everyone asks about is the one tied to a skinny singer with a velvet voice. Biographers and journalists have repeated a tale in which Willie, or men associated with him, visited a famous band leader to resolve a contract that kept the singer from moving on to a bigger stage. In some versions, the holdout accepted a token payment and let the singer go. In others, the meeting was simply a stern conversation that made the point. What can be said without overreach is that a number of reputable sources report that Willie took an interest in that singer's prospects, that their paths crossed at Jersey clubs, and that the singer soon after joined a new band that made him a star. Whether Willie forced the matter has never been proved in court. It remains an oft-told story, noted here as reported lore, important to the public portrait because it shows how people saw him, a fixer who could open locked doors. Even as his reputation grew, his manner stayed approachable. Reporters later described a man who liked crowded restaurants, who picked up checks, who waved at passers-by. He bought meals for staff, carried himself like a local big spender, and liked to be seen as generous. That warmth won him favors, and it fostered a kind of civic truce. He didn't parade menace, and the neighborhoods he frequented enjoyed steady business. That didn't mean he avoided scrutiny. Gambling raids targeted the networks tied to him. Phones were tapped. Grand juries asked questions about who ran which wire rooms, how results were relayed, and where the cash went after bettors settled up. Time after time, charges named him or his close contacts, and time after time he wriggled free with a fine, a suspended term, or a case dismissed for lack of proof sufficient to convict. He was not a phantom. He lived in North Jersey suburbs, drove good cars, and kept company with personalities. Cops knew his face. He posed for pictures at charity dinners. He was aware of what that visibility meant. It made him a symbol, and symbols attract attention. When the U.S. Senate set its sights on organized crime, public hearings offered a stage where private power could be dragged into view. Senator Estes Kefauver and his committee started moving city to city in 1950 and 1951, and the names they sought included his. Subpoenas flew, and cameras waited. Many underworld figures planned to take the Fifth Amendment at every question. Willie had a different instinct. He liked to talk. He found showmanship hard to resist. Before those hearings, though, pressure already had increased. Frank Costello needed quiet to manage his New York interests. Vito Genovese, back from exile, wanted the top spot and tightened his alliances. Joe Adonis, heavily probed, weighed exile of his own. New Jersey was a crossroads among them. And Willie's domain was now under three different shadows: the law, rival ambitions, and public curiosity. He kept making his rounds. He kept visiting clubs. He kept up the friendly routine that had carried him for years. Yet the world around him had changed. The war was over, television was exploding, and crime was no longer whispered about in barbershops. It was displayed in living rooms on the evening news. Court records from the late 1940s and early 1950s list more gambling counts, more bookmaking conspiracy arrests, more charges of running numbers operations from nondescript storefronts. Nothing explosive by itself, but the constant drumbeat kept his name in print. Still, he seemed unbothered. He laughed with pressmen, ribbed local detectives, and played the part of an almost civic character. Then came the committee, and with it the most famous scene in his story. New Jersey's public heard a live, unfiltered version of a man they had only seen at a distance, affable, quick with a quip, and unusually open for someone in his line of work. That moment changed his life, and the lives of many around him, because it suggested a line had been crossed inside his world. Organizations that thrive on silence fear a man who cannot resist a microphone. From that point on, his path narrowed. Yet to understand why that moment mattered, you have to see how he grew into it. A boy who figured out how to win friends in hard neighborhoods. A bootleg broker who kept people smiling. A gambling boss who could walk into any club and shake every hand. And a fixer who, according to reports that never quite faded, helped a singer step into the big time. He rose on charm and connections, and the trait that helped him rise his voice was about to become his greatest risk. If you're comfortable, close your eyes as you listen to the rest. Imagine the clink of silverware in a busy roadhouse, the rustle of newspaper pages, the murmur when a known face walks in. Picture the phone lines that carried results from racetracks, the runners who hurried between storefronts, the quiet meetings after midnight that settled disputes. Keep that scene in mind as we move forward, because the next stretch takes him from neighborhood celebrity to national curiosity, from backroom broker to a man in a spotlight he could not turn off. When you're ready, say the word, and we'll continue with the chapter that put Willie Moretti on television and on a collision course with the people he had spent a lifetime trying to keep calm. Television sets warmed living rooms as if they were new hearths, glass boxes humming in the corners while families leaned in, plates on laps and eyes wide. Senators had decided to put the country's back rooms on display, and the committee's traveling circus reporters thick as flies, lights hot as August rolled into New Jersey with a promise. Names would be read, faces shown, secrets nudged into daylight. Subpoenas reached barbershops and gambling flats, country clubs and city halls. When the papers said Willie was on the list, no one in Bergen or Hudson was surprised. He had been the smiling conductor of after-hours traffic for years, and the whole state knew it. He walked into that room like a man used to rooms. The jacket sat just right, the tie was crisp, and the grin that got checks paid and arguments cooled, stayed put, even as flashbulbs popped. Senators tried stern. He gave them sunny. They asked where he lived. He teased that everyone already knew. They pressed about his work. He offered that he liked restaurants, liked people, liked a good time. The questioners wanted a villain. What they got, at least at first, was a showman who punctured their seriousness with quips, so quick the spectators laughed before the stenographers could finish clattering. According to transcripts and newsreels, he did something unusual for a man in his position. He answered more than most did, not fully, not in a way that tied knots around him, but enough to seem unafraid. Nothing about that day made his world safer. Silence is the shield where he came from, and he had already been testing patience. In the years leading up to the hearings, raids had exposed a web of betting rooms that fed horse odds and ball scores across the region. Police reports linked him to phone banks hidden behind tailor shops and candy stores, to couriers who moved envelopes on predictable routes, to managers who tracked wagers with pencils and calm hands. Charges piled up: conspiracy to keep an illegal book, maintaining a gambling place, collecting on sports bets. Old arrest cards list fines and suspended terms, the kind of outcomes common for gambling cases then. He treated those court dates like bad weather. Wait it out, wipe off the windshield, drive on. The way the betting worked was not a mystery to anyone who paid attention, but the details stayed vague on purpose. Results came from the tracks through private wires or coded calls. Runners took wagers in social clubs or pool halls. If a bettor hit a long shot, payment arrived fast enough to keep trust intact. Layoff bets spread risk across different towns. Everyone's goal was predictability without noise. Willie's skill was keeping small storms from becoming floods. He didn't bark orders, he persuaded. He made rival outfits shake hands at his table and leave feeling they'd won. That talent helped after repeal, when liquor money dried up and gaming money kept flowing. It also laid the bedrock for the spotlight that finally found him. Stories about him often drift into nightclubs because his life did. He didn't sing or play, but he knew everyone who did. In the late 1930s and early 40s, North Jersey roadhouses drew crowds out of Manhattan with a promise of music, food, and a little mystery. The rustic cabin in Englewood Cliffs became a hub, its bandstand carrying voices out over the radio to listeners who had never driven that winding hill road. A slim crooner from Hoboken took the mic there and turned heads. Biographers later wrote that Willie took a shine to the kid, that he said the boy had something rare. Another band leader in New York had the singer under a contract that kept him in place. Accounts conflict, but many retell a scene in which Willie or his friends visited, talked about fairness, and soon the singer had a new path. Some say the release cost a token $1. Others say the contract was bought out with negotiations and pressure that didn't leave bruises but made intentions plain. None of it was proved in court, but the tale endured because it felt true to the man. Not a bully with a bat, a fixer with a smile. The committee wanted to turn rumors into records. Senators asked about gambling offices by street name. They brought up associates: Joe Adonis with the sleek suits, Frank Costello with the politician's patience, Abner, Longy, Zwillman, Newark's businessman king. They asked who gave orders across the river for the organization Costello led, while Luciano was gone. Reporters later wrote that Willie shrugged at titles. He said he knew a lot of people. He said he visited friends, ate meals, placed a bet now and then, tried to stay out of quarrels. When a prosecutor asked if he ever made money from protection, he brushed the word away. When someone used the phrase, "the syndicate," he smiled like they were pitching a movie. Even as he ducked, he entertained. The audience at home laughed. The men whose privacy he had punctured did not. For years, his name had bubbled up in municipal scandals that hinted at quiet help from public servants. You can find references in old clippings to patrolmen who looked the other way, to detectives who liked certain envelopes, to councilmen who suddenly keeled toward licenses that favored friendly tavern owners. The language in those reports is careful. Alleged payments, suspected influence, patterns that implied cozy ties. Willie's method, by most accounts, was less about threats than about keeping everybody content. A holiday ham for a precinct, a contribution to a lodge dinner, tickets to a prize fight. The request attached to each gift was simple: keep business calm. That sort of arrangement was common in those years, and not just in New Jersey. It rarely met a courtroom in a way that stuck, but when the Senate pulled the curtain back, the public saw the overlap between civic life and nighttime enterprise, and they saw Willie smiling in the middle of it. His personal manner made him beloved by some and maddening to others. He would stroll into a restaurant, hug the owner, slap a waiter's shoulder, tell a joke that was just on the right side of polite, order for the table, pay up front, and leave an extra wad for the busboys. He moved like a mayor without a city hall. People around town talked about his charm as if it were a public service. When trouble flared, two bookmakers arguing over a client, a club owner short on cash to cover a big week, he arranged a meeting at a diner, ordered coffee for everyone, and didn't leave until a payment schedule was settled. He meant to make commerce smooth. The crimes attached to that role, unlicensed gambling, extortion in the soft form of insurance, tax avoidance, were the cost of his system. He knew the risk. He thought he could manage it with goodwill and lawyers. Taxmen eventually knocked harder. In the late 1940s, revenue agents started looking at the gap between his spending and his reported income. Federal files from that period suggest they were doing the same in dozens of cities, building cases where they could against figures who lived big and claimed small. Willie's talent for keeping paper trails thin frustrated those efforts. He preferred cash. He put property in relatives' names. He borrowed from friends when he wanted a new car. When asked under oath to explain his finances, he joked that he did all right at the track. A laugh in the gallery didn't change the math on the agent's desk. The investigation never landed him the way it did other famous names, but it added weight to the pile pressing down. Another pile grew from inside. Organizers who ran New York families wanted discipline, not headlines. Costello's approach depended on reducing noise and nurturing political connections. Genovese, after his return from exile, counted votes like a ward boss and gripped what he could. Adonis picked up immigration trouble and looked south with an eye on safer skies. In that crowded chessboard, Jersey needed to be placid. Willie kept Jersey prosperous, but he also liked a full dining room and an open microphone. Friends later told journalists that he didn't know when to leave a stage. He stayed to savor every laugh. He found it hard to swallow a clever line. The same instinct that got him far made him a liability when the country started taping everything. What did those gambling charges look like up close? Think of a police captain pushing through a door behind a shoeshine stand and finding phones, racing forms, a chalkboard with odds, and 3 men scribbling. Think of a raid on a social club where card tables sat loaded for nightly play, callers shouted results, and a metal box held cash for payouts. Reporters would print his name even when he wasn't in the room because they believed, rightly or not, that the network in that neighborhood owed its life to his say-so. He faced hearings more than once, gave bond, and walked back to his routine by evening. For a long time, it all felt strangely normal, like a tax for doing business in a city that enjoyed itself after dark. The day of his committee appearance gave that normalcy a shove. He answered some questions, passed on many, and cracked wise often enough that operators in back booths shook their heads. A famous moment in press accounts went this way. Pressed on whether he knew certain figures, he said you couldn't live in North Jersey without knowing everyone by sight. Asked if he feared for his safety, he grinned and said he worried more about his diet. A newsreel narrator all but winked along, as if America had been granted a charming tour of a forbidden garden. But among men who clung to quiet like a life raft, this was a breach. The code did not bend for cameras. Behind the performance was a health rumor that had started swirling months, maybe years, earlier. Friends said he wasn't sleeping as well, that his jokes stretched past the moment, that he forgot who he'd told a story to. Police gossip sheets mentioned a long-running illness that could affect judgment. Later histories repeat that he suffered from advanced syphilis, an infection that, if untreated for too long, can cloud the mind and sharpen reckless instincts. Doctors never testified about his medical records in public, so the truth sits under layers of hearsay. Still, that belief, true or not, shaped how his peers saw him. If he seemed looser, if he spoke when he should have zipped his lips, they would pin it on a condition and, in their cold arithmetic, decide what to do about it. Even with that worry buzzing, he stayed social. He kept visiting the same roadside grills, the same clubs with red leather booths and bands that knew every standard. He loved a big night with company. He'd wave to cops as if they were cousins and ask reporters how their kids were doing. He bought gifts for staff when a place hit an anniversary. He delivered envelopes to a widow whose husband had fallen ill working a door for him. Those gestures mattered to the people who received them. They formed a second reputation that lived alongside the criminal one. A generous neighbor who left big tips and didn't forget names. That dual-image lawbreaker and local benefactor complicated how communities responded when the cameras came. Sources from law enforcement often placed him under Frank Costello on the organizational chart of the day, a kind of regional manager for North Jersey who coordinated with Newark's power brokers. Some call him underboss. Some call him a captain with extra reach. Titles in that world were fluid and colored by who was telling the story. What didn't change was the list of activities tied to his orbit. Illegal sports books at back tables, the policy numbers game that knitted through working-class neighborhoods, card games that rotated addresses on a schedule so predictable insiders joked about it, slot machines stashed in storage when a new chief promised a cleanup. Protection, that polite word for guaranteeing a bar wouldn't be hassled as long as it made a weekly donation to the right collector. Add in whispers about loans that came with high interest and quick enforcement, and you have the common portfolio for men like him. Each count surfaced in indictments here and there. Few stuck long enough to change his rhythm. He also understood show business as more than a hobby. Acts who played Jersey owed him introductions to owners across the region. Agents who wanted a star booked at a hot club took his call first. Musicians who needed a favor, maybe a rehearsal space, maybe a quick loan for a new horn, came to his table. This wasn't charity alone. It was influence. If he helped a career at the right time, he could count on goodwill later, maybe for endorsements, maybe to keep a nosy columnist out of a back room. The Sinatra story stuck because it fit a pattern. He liked lifting a curtain for talent he believed in. Whether he leaned hard in that famous case is something the courts never pinned down. But if you ask old-timers, they say the singer shook his hand with a gratitude that lasted decades. The hearings didn't end his legal headaches. They increased them. Prosecutors in New Jersey and New York, eager to capitalize on public momentum, scheduled more raids. They refiled gambling conspiracy cases they might have let stall in quieter seasons. Judges saw juries who had watched the broadcasts, and no one could pretend ignorance anymore. Willie faced a carousel of court dates, sometimes 2 in a week in different counties. He showed up in good suits, smiled at the clerks, nodded to the bailiffs, and kept answering questions the same way. Light where he could be, careful when he had to be, silent when a lawyer tugged his sleeve. His friends urged discretion. Some people around Costello began limiting contact. They didn't want a man who attracted cameras sitting at their elbow when they met a councilman or worked out a union deal. Others tried to tutor him in restraint. No ad-libbing, no jokes, short visits only. He promised to behave, then walked into a room and turned it into his again. That compulsion to perform was as much a part of him as his handshake. It's hard to tell a fish to stop swimming. At the same time, the cast around him shifted. Joe Adonis took a hard look at deportation and the pressure that came with it. Zwillman kept one foot in legitimate businesses that wrapped his influence in respectability. Genovese tightened ties with men who prized order and punished disobedience. In that atmosphere, anyone who looked like a leak risked more than a strong word. The old rule held, the group matters more than the individual, and talkers, even charming ones, can't be allowed to set the tone. Through it all, the neighborhoods that had grown up with him kept shrugging off the chaos. They still saw him buying coffee at the counter, still heard his hello from a block away. He sponsored local teams, tossed a few dollars in collection cans for injured firemen, and sent flowers to funerals. He had the money to do those things because of his rackets, and he had the rackets because those neighborhoods wanted certain things provided quietly. That is the central puzzle of his life. The public insisted on condemnation at a distance, while accepting the convenience at arm's length. Willie lived in that contradiction as if it were clean air. After the committee roadshow passed, he tried to reclaim habit. He ate at the same hours, kept appointments with bookmakers to reconcile accounts, checked in with club owners about their weekend draws, and maintained the lines to New York. He also fielded more inquiries from grand juries than ever before. Some he handled with his lawyer and a nod. Others called him into rooms where stenographers bent their heads, and a prosecutor repeated questions in slightly different words to test his patience. Anyone who listens to tapes from that era comes away with the same impression. He was breezy until pressed hard. Then he clammed up. It was a survival tactic, learned over decades. The fallout from television lingered. Editorials scolded. Pastors preached about temptation and rot. Columnists made him a character, half comic, half dangerous. Good copy in a slow news week. That attention made it easier for the next raid to find him, the next subpoena to include his name, the next politician to point to his photo as proof that their bill was needed. In an odd way, the public love for his jokes gave fuel to the machinery that would grind him down. Inside the fold he once managed, patience thinned. You can track it by the way friends began to take meetings without him, the way phone calls went through intermediaries, the way invitations to big sit-downs didn't arrive. He wasn't being cut off entirely. He still had value, still brought in numbers from bettors who trusted him more than anyone else. But decisions were drifting elsewhere. The organization he served never advertised demotions. It showed them by who sat at the table and who waited outside. He chose not to disappear. Some men, sensing the wind turn, go quiet, move to a smaller house, eat at home, read the sports page, answer the doorbell only for family. He kept the old rhythm. Late lunch in a bright place where the staff knew his order. A chat with a columnist who wanted color. A tour of night spots to check who was singing and who was winning at the dice table. A last stop at a diner for coffee and eggs. He liked motion. He believed movement made him hard to pin down. Maybe it did for a while. Maybe it also made him easy to find. By the time that year drew to its last season, everyone around him felt the tension, even if they pretended to ignore it. The state kept filing papers. The federal men kept tracing dollars. Associates kept glancing over their shoulders when his name was mentioned. The man who had always solved others' disputes had become a walking dispute himself, the subject no one wanted to talk about in full sentences. He didn't slouch. He didn't hide. He was too proud and, in his mind, too useful. He thought charm still counted in a business that rewards certainty. He thought a smile, one more lunch, one more joke could smooth the wrinkle. History says otherwise. Yet, for all the strain, you can't understand him if you reduce him to headlines. He was the product of a century that gave immigrants narrow lanes and then scolded them for taking detours. He found his way in the gaps between law and appetite. He cut corners, yes, many, and made money from vices that the public consumed while pretending virtue. He used influence where it didn't belong. He coaxed favors from public servants who owed their loyalty to citizens, not to him. He hurt competitors who tried to operate without his blessing by squeezing suppliers and leaning on landlords. He lived in the wrong, but he also lived in a network of mutual obligation that felt normal to the people who shared that time and place. The committee had forced the country to admit the network existed. Willie had made the admission feel like entertainment. That is why the reaction inside his circle was so severe. He had given a face to something that wanted to be faceless. He had turned a whisper into a grin broadcast coast to coast. That, more than any single indictment, set the trajectory for the months ahead. The same public that had chuckled at his lines would soon read a different kind of story about him, a quieter one with fewer jokes, and not because he ran out of them. We leave him here for the moment, still making his way from club to club, still shaking hands, still juggling the court calendar and the dinner calendar as if they were equal parts of a routine. In the shadows around him, decisions were being weighed by men who preferred conclusions to debate. The hearings had given them their pretext, the health rumors their excuse, the code their commandment. He had built a life on knowing how to calm people. Now he was the reason rooms went still when the door opened. The next stretch brings that slow pressure to a point, and it does so in the places he loved most. Bright rooms at lunchtime, polite chatter, a plate on the table, a man who never expected the spotlight to become a target. Winter settled over the river towns with a calm that could fool you. Storefronts hung tinsel in their windows. Carols drifted out of radios. And steam rose from street grates where the cold met the city's hidden warmth. He moved through that season as he always had, a man who seemed to know every block and every face. After the hearings, he kept his routine, or tried to. Lunch in a place where the owner shook his hand at the door, a round of coffees for whichever detectives wandered in, a stop at a bookmaker's office to square figures from last week's games, a visit to a club to hear the late set and make sure the weekend booking would fill the room. He believed that constancy itself was a shield, that ordinary days stitched together could muffle the noise that television had made. The wire rooms ran smoother when he was around. Horse tracks posted scratches, odds shifted with new wagers, and someone had to balance the load so no single office got wiped out by a hot streak. He had men who handled that arithmetic, but he liked to see the chalkboards himself every so often. Numbers wiped and rewritten with steady hands, phones buzzing with coded phrases that kept strangers guessing. Games in college gyms and big league parks fed the nightly rhythm. If a bettor called in a play on a rivalry game, the clerk would punch a ticket and slide it into a stack with a quiet efficiency that came from practice. At week's end, collectors made their rounds, envelopes crossed counters, and everyone took home a slice. Illegal? Yes, and recorded as such in complaint after complaint. Routine? In those neighborhoods? Absolutely. Extortion claims never left him fully alone either. Owners of taverns and clubs liked quiet, and quiet had a price. If a new bar opened without anyone's introduction, a polite visit followed. The message was dressed up as advice. You want to keep the wrong sort of fellow from staging a disturbance on Saturday night. You want the glass to stay in the windows. You want licenses to renew without a hiccup. Make a weekly payment, and those headaches won't arrive. Police reports and sworn statements from the era use words like protection and coercion. He preferred softer labels. He called it insurance, and argued that it kept trouble out of rooms where working folks came to relax. However you named it, it lived in the stack of charges tied to his circle, and it helped fund the generosity that kept him popular. He had arrests on his card going back years for gambling, conspiracy to keep a common gaming place, maintaining a betting parlor, and related offenses. He had paid fines, done short terms, had suspended sentences, and walked away from cases that fell apart because the key witness moved, or a search warrant came up thin, or a jury decided the cops raided the wrong backroom. Each outcome taught him something about the boundaries of his time. Talk softly, keep the machines out of sight when the heat rises, rotate addresses, and never confuse headlines with handcuffs. It was a living lesson in risk management, and it kept him in motion. He was careful about one thing above all: make friends across lines. He liked ward leaders and beat cops, reporters and club owners, smally-time bettors and big spenders. He understood that a kind word on a cold morning could soften a night's mistake. He built his life on that principle. Friends remember him dropping off a bundle for a hospital fundraiser or buying uniforms for a kid's baseball team without posing for a photo. Those gestures mattered not only because they were kind, but because they bound him to the place he lived. You cannot tell his story without admitting that the neighborhoods around him accepted the arrangement. They knew what he did. They also knew he kept places lively, made sure problems were contained, and handed out good cheer like a merchant hands out samples. That magnetism brought in entertainers as easily as gamblers. He had an ear for a voice and an eye for a performer who could fill a room. He enjoyed helping. When a promising singer needed a booking, he made a call. When a traveling band leader needed an advance to cover payroll after a bad week, he floated a loan with a firm due date. In old interviews, musicians called him a friend to showfolk, a guy who remembered names and anniversaries and checked in with a cigar and a hug backstage. It wasn't charity. It was influence with a smile. The famous story about the crooner from Hoboken belongs to that pattern. Reporters, biographers, and even sworn testimony in later cases spoke of Willie as someone who made introductions that changed the singer's trajectory. The hard version of the tale, the one with threats and a $20 contract release from a reluctant band leader, has always been contested. The softer version talks, persuasion, and a deal that let a rising star move up fits the man in the era. Courts never settled the point. The story still clings to his name because it shows what he did best. While the public argued over lore, the state compiled files. After the televised hearings, grand juries in several counties began calling in bookmakers, clerks, and runners who had made plea deals on unrelated cases. They asked about the phones, the way bets were laid off across the map, the pickup schedule on Mondays, the money room on Wednesdays when the paper slips were tallied. More often than not, a cautious witness would shrink memory to fog. Still, indictments stacked higher than usual in 1,950 and 1,951. He answered them with the tools he knew. He posted bond quickly. He brought a lawyer who had handled gambling cases for decades. He took a plea on a minor count to make a larger count evaporate. He treated it like a stubborn winter, dress warm, and wait it out. He heard the advice to go south for a spell. Friends told him to take a break in Miami or Havana, where sea air and a deck chair might do him good. Later accounts claim that men higher up pressed him to step out of sight until the papers found new targets. He nodded, then walked right back into his round of lunches and late shows. He trusted his own ways more than any counsel. He believed that a public man could not go private without losing the aura that gave him leverage. That belief had served him for years. It would betray him soon. His health had become a whispered subplot. In hallways and cars and quiet corners, people said he wasn't himself. They said he repeated stories, mixed up names, burst into laughter at odd times, and seemed to enjoy the sensation of an audience too much for a man whose business required discretion. The rumor had a clinical label attached to it: advanced syphilis, a condition that, without treatment, may erode judgment. No public medical record was ever displayed to confirm that diagnosis. What exists is gossip, remembered impressions, and the explanatory instinct of people who watched him grow bolder when they wanted him to retreat. True or false, the belief affected how his peers measured the danger. A man rumored to be ill might say the wrong thing without meaning harm. Organizations built on silence can't afford that risk. The committee's roadshow did more than embarrass him. It put his crowd on a scoreboard in front of the whole country. That changed the behavior of every player. A judge who might have shrugged at a first-time gambling offense now felt eyes on the bench. A mayor who used to trade winks with tavern owners found his phone logs requested by reporters. A state bureau that had treated betting as a nuisance started talking like it was a public menace. He felt that weather change each time he walked into court and saw a new assistant prosecutor at the table, eager to notch a name. He answered in the old way, with a grin and a handshake and an open wallet for bail. But the tone of the rooms had shifted. He also felt the difference at the tables where he used to speak freely. Friends grew cautious. Some colleagues insisted that meetings be kept short, with fewer jokes and no lingering over coffee. They'd nod, speak in code, and leave. He would start a story, get halfway through a punchline, and find that a companion was already putting on a coat. He called it rudeness. They called it survival. If he resented it, he did not show it. He answered social chill with more warmth, as if he could thaw a hardened policy with charm. Law enforcement focused on the mechanics of his rackets. Numbers games in Newark and the surrounding towns had grown into a daily ritual for thousands of workers who put a few cents on a favorite sequence. Those games needed collectors, writers, and bankers. Investigators targeted the middle tier, thinking those people could point up the ladder. They raided apartments where pads and coins sat stacked in cigar boxes, arrested men carrying paper slips in their socks, seized ledgers that used initials instead of names. His figure appeared in those files as the beneficiary of systems that hung together across neighborhoods, a man whose approval helped certain bankers hold their posts and whose disapproval could end a route. Extortion counts flared when a bar owner switched allegiances and told police that a weekly fee bought peace. The case paperwork shows a pattern, plenty of detail about the low tiers, thinner proof at the top, outcomes that landed somewhere between a plea and a dismissal. He kept one eye on New York. The people he answered to had their own storms to manage. Frank Costello preferred quiet and influence, and valued New Jersey as a reliable revenue stream that didn't generate extra heat. Vito Genovese, rebuilding after his exile, wanted better control over all the organs that made money. Newark's wheelman Abner Longies Willman continued to cloak his dealings inside legitimate enterprises, where ledgers could explain away bulk purchases and large cash infusions. Joe Adonis, always immaculate, was beginning to look over his shoulder at federal agencies with clipboards and immigration files. In that triangle, Willie's job had been to keep Jersey steady and friendly. He had excelled at that for years. Now he was the noisy gear. He didn't change his habit of treating cops like cousins. If he walked into a place and saw uniforms at the counter, he would pull up a chair and pay for their sandwiches, joke about their boss, and ask after their families. Most of those officers returned the courtesy by staying civil. Others took the greetings as bait and looked harder at any car he drove. The old arrangement play nice, and the city plays nice back, was cracking under scrutiny. He tried to mend it with more flowers, bigger tips, and another round on the house for the band. You can hear the stubborn faith in the accounts of the time. He believed in the smoothing power of a kind gesture, even as the world around him learned to resist it. In the spring and summer after his testimony, much of his calendar was taken up by court visits. Simple appearances to have a date set. Hearings on motions to suppress evidence from raids, he said, were sloppy. Arraignments on fresh conspiracy counts tying him to betting offices whose landlords knew him by first name. He walked in with confidence, faced the judge, signed where he had to, shook hands with the clerk, and went back to lunch. Newsmen waited to ask the standard questions. He gave the standard answers. Doing all right, eating well, hoping the Yankees go far. He turned the grind into a casual stroll. Yet the other grind, the one inside his world, wore through patience. The closer ones were blunt. Quiet down. Cut the public circuit. Let others handle face-to-face meetings with bookmaking crews. Assign a trusted man to run the weekly reconciliations. Don't talk to reporters. Don't offer quips in corridors. He nodded, joked that they were trying to change his nature, and went on being himself. He didn't bring heavy security. His confidence and his love for familiar rooms made him casual about danger. He might arrive with a friend or two and sit near the door because it let him wave at every face coming in. He found joy in that attention. He felt safest in places that knew him best. That habit comforted him, and it also set a pattern anyone could read. By late summer, local and national newspapers had shifted him from amusing witness to cautionary headline. The same scrapbook that held clippings about his one-liners now held pieces about his accumulation of cases and the rumor that his own crowd was tired of the show. This was not gossip confined to alleys. It ran in print for everyone to see. Some used euphemisms, talk that certain men would prefer him retired. Others, less delicate, wrote that his willingness to talk on camera had sealed his fate inside. He still appeared at clubs. He still picked up checks. He still acted like nothing irreversible had started. On some mornings he drove out to racetracks where he was known, not to get lost in the crowd, but to drink in the familiar rhythm of horses on the far turn, and fans clutching programs as if paper could chant a winner home. Monmouth Park, Belmont, the circuits tied accents from every borough and county into one chorus. He loved that bustle. He would stand near a rail, listen to a trainer give a spiel to a hopeful bettor, and smile. That smile showed up in photographs, a grin broad enough to read a block away. It belonged to a man who believed he could stay in the same groove if he pressed harder into it. Around him, men set a meeting for a different purpose. According to later reporting and private recollections, messages went out inviting him to lunch with friends at a place he liked. The plan was wrapped in courtesy. Nothing dramatic, just a meal and talk about calming the waters. He accepted. Why wouldn't he? Lunch was his operating theater. A plate on the table, a laugh, a deal made, and everyone happy. He had solved problems in that setting all his life. The day that invitation came due arrived with the plainness of any weekday. He did morning errands and took calls. He spoke to a club owner about the weekend's draw and asked a driver to swing by later to pick up envelopes from 2 spots that had missed the usual collection hour. He checked a court date for the following week with his attorney's office. He couldn't resist adding a joke for the secretary. He called a columnist to promise a better story next time, one with names he could actually print. Then he headed for the restaurant, the one with the friendly staff, the regular corner, the little room off to the side where you could talk without raising your voice because the walls soaked up chatter. That walk through the door felt like 100 others. Staff greeted him. A couple of men at a nearby table said hello with the ease of people who expected to see him there. He chatted, made a wisecrack about the cold roast beef, and asked for coffee. Friends would later recall his mood as sunny. He had not built a career by bracing for the worst in places that felt like living rooms. He trusted the ordinary. He trusted the script he had written for himself all the way back to the first time he set a cup on a saucer and started a negotiation with a smile. Outside, cars rolled past the windows. Inside, waiters moved plates, radios whispered a ball score, and the clink of glasses set a rhythm that made the dining room feel like a safe harbor. The invitation he'd accepted led him not to a stage or a courtroom, but to this small, bright space at midday, the exact scene where he had spent years turning turbulence into calm. He stepped into that comfort with the same easy stride, unaware that the rules of his world had changed enough to turn the most familiar place into the riskiest choice he could make. The first minutes felt like any friendly lunch. He chatted about last night's band, told a story that made the busboy grin, and teased the owner about serving coffee strong enough to wake a statue. The men who joined him were familiar faces in suits that matched his own taste, tidy and sober, the kind that didn't draw attention. They spoke in low tones about small things first, who was opening a new tavern on the highway, which horse had looked good at morning workouts, whether the rain was coming on Friday. A plate arrived. He sliced a bite, gestured with his fork to make a point, and set it down again while laughter patted the air. It was the sort of meal he considered his office. A table, a few friends, and the pleasant hum of a place where the owner knew your name. What followed, the city would never forget, though no one agreed on every detail. In the middle of that ordinary scene, noise broke the calm. Quick, hard sounds cracked the room's easy rhythm. Diners froze, waiters ducked on instinct, and the men at his table moved in a blur. When the rush ended, the room shook with the shock that follows a sudden storm. He was still in his chair, then he wasn't. Staff cried out for help. People rushed to the door. A car engine rose on the street outside and faded. In a matter of heartbeats, the lunch that had begun like so many others turned into the endpoint of his life. It happened in early October 1951, a bright day that did not hint at anything unusual. The restaurant sat in a North Jersey town he trusted, the kind of neighborhood spot where midday regulars felt like family. Police arrived fast, secured the room, and began the hollow job of asking staff to retell what they barely believed. Newspapers carried the headline within hours, some using the phrase "the press favored then" for killings tied to the underworld. The stories said the man who had made New Jersey's nights hum had been cut down at a table he treated like a second home. He was in his 50s. He had outlasted Prohibition, out-talked committee members on national television, and outmaneuvered judges and prosecutors for decades. He could not outlast the rule that his own world enforced when it felt threatened. The investigation moved along the lines familiar to that era. Detectives traced the car that witnesses mentioned and found it abandoned in a nearby neighborhood. Ballistics experts collected shells and made notes for files that would later gather dust. Officers pulled arrest cards of men who might have reason to be nearby and compiled lists of associates who'd been seen with him in recent weeks. The restaurant owner made a statement and tried to keep his business afloat under a wave of reporters. No one was quickly charged. That lack of closure was as much a feature of the time as the crime itself. When they spoke to the press, officials used careful phrases. They said they were exploring leads. They said they believed the act was the work of professionals. They said the motive likely lay inside the same circles in which he'd moved for years. The meaning of the moment did not wait for a grand jury. People around town already knew what the headlines meant. Within his circle, everyone had heard whispers that he'd become too visible, too willing to talk, too unpredictable. The rumors about his health advanced syphilis, they said, with the troubling effect on judgment that disease can bring, had become part of every conversation about him. The televised committee appearance, while charming to the public, had put fear into men who needed silence. Combining those facts produced a conclusion that spread quickly. This had been a decision taken by his own side. A brutal kind of house cleaning that followed their code. Many articles written later use words like believed, reputed, and widely reported to link the act to that logic. Officially, the case never pinned a name to the act in a courtroom. Unofficially, the story hardened almost immediately. His funeral told a different story, the one that had run alongside the criminal record throughout his life. A man who liked company, drew company, even at the end. The procession included family, ordinary neighbors, and a few faces recognizable to anyone who read the papers. There were flowers from clubs, envelopes for charities, instead of extravagant displays from people who could not afford a photo in the next day's paper. Police stood at a respectful distance, but not far enough to miss an introduction. The service stayed quiet. The remarks remembered a friendly neighbor and a devoted relative, not a man whose name had lived on booking sheets and subpoena lists. That split is the truth of many public lives. People hold two images at once and find a way to reconcile them because the person belonged to both. Back in the city, bookmaking crews took their cues from the shock. Some apartments that had served as wire rooms went dark for a while. Numbers collectors laid low, sending substitutes to keep routes alive without attracting a second glance. Owners of taverns who paid for protection waited a week and listened for a new voice on the phone. The business did not end, because appetite does not end. But it paused and shifted. Leadership in New Jersey reconfigured almost at once. Histories written later point to men who had long prepared for a larger role. Gerardo Jerry Katina, a steady hand with strong ties to the New York leadership, and Richie the Boot Boyardo, the tough Newark boss whose neighborhood reach was deep. They did not stage a parade. They just showed up where decisions had to be made and made them. That was the function he had performed for so long. After his death, the function remained. Only the names changed. If you step back from the day itself, the arc comes into focus. He had found his footing as a teenager when Prohibition opened an illicit market for liquor that legitimate businesses could not legally serve. His early record shows arrests for liquor violations, transportation, and storage. He learned the practical map of North Jersey, the back roads, the friendly barns, the safe storefronts well enough to make deliveries run like clockwork. He had a temper, but he preferred to persuade. That made him invaluable when the business changed. When repeal shut down bootlegging, he moved his talent for coordination to gambling. He oversaw bookmaking networks that linked small parlors and back rooms to a wider system of odds, layoff bets, and payouts. His name appears time and again in complaints charging conspiracy to keep a gambling place, and sometimes extortion counts, usually tied to accusations that clubs paid to avoid hassle. He also faced tax inquiries that alleged his income did not match his spending, a familiar pressure point in that era. Often the cases ended with fines, suspended sentences, or dismissals for lack of fully developed proof. But the drumbeat, never ceased. He also held a reputation as a fixer in the borderland between show business and the night economy. Musicians and singers owed him favors because he advanced money when no bank would and arranged bookings when no agent could. The most famous story connected to his name is the one about the Hoboken singer whose rise depended on leaving a contract with a bandleader who didn't want to let go. Accounts differ on whether threats were used. Many swear they were not, and that the transaction came down to persuasion and a token payment wrote into the public version for effect. Whatever the truth, the singer soon moved on and became a star. The tale attached itself to Willie because it fit his profile, even if the harder edges stayed in rumor. A man who opened doors that seemed closed, who liked to see talent shine in rooms he kept lively. The Kefauver hearings amplified his profile beyond anything he had experienced. On television, in front of the country, he turned a grill session into something like a lounge act, thereby made enemies he couldn't see. He answered more than most did, sprinkling replies with humor, and seemed unafraid. That charisma played well with viewers, and very poorly with his colleagues. If you depended on secrecy to keep money flowing, the last man you wanted near a microphone was a charmer who felt a stage inviting him forward. From that point on, he walked a short bridge. Add to that the circulating belief that he was no longer as careful as he'd once been, and the bridge narrowed to a line. After his death, prosecutors tried to organize the cases still on their calendars. Indictments that named him had to be revised. Some targets who'd been charged alongside him took pleas to put their files away. Others rode out the storm and returned to familiar routines once the news cycle moved on. Enforcement did not stop. The 1,950s would bring more raids, more committee hearings, more headline shows of force. But the central figure in North Jersey who'd once served as a go-between for Joe Adonis, Frank Costello, and Newark interests was gone, and that changed how calls were returned. Costello's camp seemed to benefit from the calm that followed. Genovese, never fond of unpredictable variables, lost an irritant without lifting a public finger. Newark's balance tilted toward a few steady names that would dominate the next decade. People who had loved him for his warmth remembered 100 little scenes. He overpaid for a fundraiser raffle and gave the prize to a child. He slipped a roll of bills to a cook who needed to replace a broken stove. He told councilmen jokes in the doorway and walked away before anyone had to call it a meeting. He kept straight-abacked men at ease, with small talk and good food. Those memories don't erase the harm that came from his rackets. Gambling brought debt and trouble to plenty of homes. Extortion, however politely presented, is coercion. Public servants who took favors broke trust that citizens deserve. You can admit both sides. He could be generous, and he helped build systems that depended on breaking the law. Our aim here is to see the whole, not to paint a simple picture. In his absence, myths multiplied. Some said the lunch was a mercy imposed by higher-ups who claimed, coldly, to be sparing a friend from a worse fate at the hands of the state. Others said there was nothing merciful about it. It was management, pure and simple, removing a risk to money and order. A few insisted outside rivals used the moment to make New Jersey lean their way. The truth likely sits close to the simplest explanation. The men he'd worked with decided the combination of public performance and deteriorating discretion created a danger their rulebook could not tolerate. They solved it in the way their world always had, quickly and without public discussion. Official records never settled the point, because the people who knew the most did not talk. A footnote often appears in accounts of his life that says his manner and the famous singer's contract story inspired a small corner of a later novel and film, where a crooner is released from a binding agreement after a frightening visit. That comparison is always a step removed fiction echoing rumor, and it's not a blueprint for anything that actually happened. But it shows how the public remembered him. As the man in the middle who could move a needle with a phone call and a dinner, who kept circles connected, and who was as at home backstage as he was in a bookmaker's office. Law enforcement, for its part, used his case to push for tighter laws. Editorials argued for stronger penalties for illegal gambling and for policies that made it harder to turn municipal offices into friends for hire. Some reforms took root. Others faded under the steady pull of habit and demand. In that era, many cities lived with a tacit understanding that certain vices would exist in controlled ways. He was a master of that balance. Without him, the balance shifted but did not disappear. His family absorbed the shock and returned to private lives as best they could. The public eye moved on to the next dramatized hearing, the next headline raid, the next courtroom drama, featuring men with careful haircuts and thicker wallets than their tax filings suggested. The people who had worked under him found new patrons and kept the wires humming. The last chapter of his life closed quickly in a room that had felt like sanctuary, and the first chapter of his legacy began the same week, in columns and conversations that tried to measure what had just happened. He had been a boy who found a way to matter in hard neighborhoods, then a young man who rode the waves of prohibition, then an organizer who stitched together a betting world that relied on speed, trust, and a smile at the counter. He had paid for his prosperity with risk and often won. He had brushed against the law so many times that he began to treat it like weather. He had made friends in every corner of nightlife because he loved company and because company was his business. When the country discovered his charm on television, he basked for a moment and believed charm could carry him further. It did not. What remains, when you reach the end of this part of his story, is the feeling of a life lived in bright rooms that hid dim corners, of a man who could make a table feel warm, even as the ledger he kept recorded cold calculations. North Jersey adjusted quickly after he was gone, because cities always do, but for a long while you could walk into a supper club or a diner that he had loved and feel an echo in the way the staff greeted a regular, in the way a band leader nodded to an old friend, in the way a bookmaker folded a slip with a practiced hand. He made those habits hum. We'll move on from the lunch that ended things and follow the strands his hands once held, how the gambling circuits he nurtured changed names and leadership, how the committees and prosecutors used his televised bravado as a cautionary lesson, how the entertainers he had encouraged navigated a world that was learning to keep stories cleaner in public. His life did not end the night New Jersey went quiet for a day. It carried forward in routines and reforms, in myth and memory, and in the way the city learned, for the 100th time, that charisma is not a shield when a code decides otherwise. In the days after the lunch that ended his run, North Jersey tried to carry on as if the music hadn't missed a beat. Clubs opened, lights blinked on at dusk, and phones in back rooms rang again. Quieter at first, then with their old confidence. People have a way of slipping back into their habits. But the empty chair at a certain corner table said what the headlines had already shouted. A man who had brokered quiet for decades was gone, and the way of doing things would change even if the storefronts stayed the same. Reporters leaned on sources and wrote that the restaurant was in Cliffside Park, the kind of place he'd always favored at midday. The stories connected dots that insiders had already traced in private. His appearance before the Senate had made him a national face. His jokes had thrilled the public and rattled colleagues who lived by silence. Health rumors, often phrased as reportedly advanced syphilis, circulated and were used to explain a loosened tongue. In that arithmetic, the motive didn't need a blackboard. The investigation produced the usual pile of forms, shell casings, and interviews, but no jury would ever hear a name read aloud. Unsolved on paper, understood in practice, that was how many chapters closed in that era. Across the river, the people he answered to resorted the map. New Jersey did not sit empty. Richie the Boot Boyardo had Newark in a firm grip and ran it like a mayor who didn't need ballots. Gerardo Jerry Catina, a calm presence with tight links to New York leadership, stepped into a broader role. The gambling machine did not break. It found new hands to oil it. Club owners who had sent holiday baskets to Willie shifted their greetings to the next caller. Bookmakers who had met him on Wednesdays at a diner now split their reconciliations between two men who sat a little farther back in the room. The money took the same paths. The names on the envelopes changed. Looking backward, you can lay out what his life's portfolio really was. Not as legend, but as a stack of activities chronicled in arrest ledgers, grand jury minutes, and old clippings. It began with liquor, when Prohibition turned a glass into contraband. He arranged deliveries, hid stock, and found drivers who knew every side road in Bergen and Passaic. The records show seizures, fines, and hearings. Then repeal erased that market overnight, so he shifted to gambling, where the law still scolded but customers remained faithful. He managed bookmaking networks, wire rooms hidden behind storefronts, runners who took wagers in clubs and candy shops, layoff arrangements that spread risk. He added the numbers game, a daily ritual of small bets knitted across neighborhoods by collectors who knew every stoop. He pressed for insurance payments from taverns and roadhouses who wanted calm. That was extortion by statute, whether or not the tone was polite. He pushed slot machines when heat allowed and stored them when it didn't. He loaned cash at high interest to operators who fell behind. He was questioned about tax returns that didn't match his spending. Now and then his name brushed against labor angles, talk of influence over truck routes or union votes, in places where deliveries and doors mattered, but those threads stayed thin in court. The core stayed the same. Gambling, protection, and the soft pressure that follows money from one envelope to the next. He ran his portfolio with charm because charm worked where he lived. A city that made room for nightlife, made room for the person who kept it smooth. He liked that role, thrived in it, and held it for years under Frank Costello's broader umbrella. Titles like underboss or captain were labels that shifted with the storyteller. What mattered was that when Jersey needed a decision, he was often in the chair. He could settle a fight over bettors with a payment plan instead of a brawl. He could tell a nervous club owner which door to keep locked and which night to hire extra staff. He believed entirely in the easing power of a smile and a meal. The Kefauver hearings punished that belief. When America saw him take questions and answer some with showman's ease, they laughed along. His colleagues did not. The contrast between public affection and private fury defined his last year. Every raid that followed, every subpoena with his name on it, added weight to an internal case against him that didn't need an indictment. That's the logic historians use when they land on the conclusion that his end was a choice from within. Courts never proved it, but the code he lived under did not require a bench to pronounce sentence. After he was gone, prosecutors did two things at once. They talked reform, and they went back to work. Reform meant proposing stiffer penalties for organized gambling and new rules that let the state yank liquor licenses from bars that doubled as betting parlors. It meant pushing for better tools to trace phone lines used to shuttle results from racetracks, and for tighter oversight of municipal offices that had treated certain visits like part of the calendar. Clean government became a headline phrase. At the same time, the rhythm on the ground didn't vanish. Police raided small rooms, swept up clerks, and stood in front of tables covered with racing forms for quick photographs. Then they went back 2 blocks over the next week, and did it again. The demand didn't shrink. The names on charge sheets changed. In the clubs he loved, musicians kept playing and remembered his easy manner. A trumpeter recalled in a later interview how he would tap the stand with a knuckle when a solo sang, grin as if he'd discovered a new star, and send a drink to the bandstand with a nod. The famous crooner he was linked to in 100 retellings kept climbing, and the old story about the contract release lingered like a chorus you can't forget. Depending on the storyteller, the scene had a threat, a calm chat, a token dollar, or a handshake in the office of a lawyer who had decided the kid would be a bigger earner free than tied down. None of those versions reached a courtroom verdict. All of them stuck because they matched how people saw Willie. The singer later denied being pushed by anyone's muscle, and biographers split over which page of lore to underline. The honest way to say it is this: he moved in the rooms where that decision ripened, and many credible sources say he helped it along. Old case files that had named him were trimmed or dropped. A bookmaker charged alongside him took a plea to a lesser count. A clerk agreed to probation, in exchange for testimony no one ultimately used. A judge sighed and told a courtroom that the central figure was no longer available, then set dates for the rest. He had been a hub in those lists. Without him, the spokes felt lighter. That made daily life easier for some and harder for others. Easier because one big target for police was gone. Harder because that big target had kept rivalries in line, and without his balancing hand, small disputes risked swelling into headaches. The men who replaced him had their own styles. Katina preferred order and quiet, and got it. Boyardo kept the tight circle around Newark as he always had. Their crews kept the betting steady through the early 1950s and into the years when new pressures reshaped the whole map. Those new pressures came from inside New York as much as from any state house. Vito Genovese wanted the top chair. In 1957, he would push Frank Costello into retirement after a close-range scare on a Manhattan staircase, then step into the spotlight, only to be dragged down by a narcotics case 2 years later. Willie didn't live to see that shakeup, but the line from his fate to those later headlines runs straight. A world that prized secrecy grew less tolerant of public personalities, and more committed to quiet operators who could withstand television and federal attention. Joe Adonis, closely tied to Willie by friendship, and often described as family through marriage depending on the source, faced deportation proceedings that sent him away by the mid-1950s. Abner Longy Zwillman, the Newark businessman boss who had once been a partner and rival by turns, died in 1950, under circumstances labeled suicide by authorities and the subject of rumors ever since. By then, the era that had made Willie's style so effective had given way to something colder and less forgiving of flair. If you go back to his personal habits, you find the notes that allowed him to ride the earlier decades. He kept solid lawyers and used them often. He posted bail before the ink dried. He moved the locations of wire rooms on a rhythm, so regular his men could follow it without a written schedule. He built relationships with ward heelers and policemen, not for dramatic favors, but for the small accommodations that keep a city's gears from grinding. He lent money with deadlines attached and expected to be repaid. The penalty for missing wasn't a spectacle. It was a phone call, a visit, a tightening of the credit that club owners depended on to make next week's payroll. He handed out gifts, paid for funerals, donated to civic drives, and showed up at charity dinners because those gestures made a public that knew his private life looked the other way when necessary. Those acts were also used in indictments to paint a picture of influence buying. Both readings can be true at once. There were more serious allegations at the edges. Extortion counts sometimes described threats to damage property or stage disturbances if a bar didn't pay. Coercion doesn't need colorful language to change a balance sheet. Tax records drew attention because his reported income could not explain the cars he drove or the parties he hosted. He was asked about those gaps and treated the questions like a chance to deliver a line. He told one hearing that he bet horses and did all right. The laugh that followed said more about his relationship with rooms than about the Internal Revenue Code. These patterns didn't set him apart. They placed him squarely in the center of a mid-century city's informal economy, where vice was treated like a utility available, regulated by men in suits, paid for in cash, and officially denied. He made that system go. He also paid for it in the end. The staff at the restaurants he favored felt the change hardest at first. Their best customer was gone. The envelope he peeled off on holidays was not coming. The stable tips he left for busboys who needed school clothes for a younger sister would not be there. Owners who had counted on his regulars to fill tables on slow winter nights adjusted their math. Yet they didn't shut down the stage. They booked another singer and kept their own code. The room lives on. The city around them agreed. The police presence felt heavier for a while, then settled back to regular levels. The newspapers moved on to the next figure who didn't know when to stop talking in front of a microphone. If you weigh the balance sheet of his harms and help, the harms outweigh. He ran illegal operations that turned people's private temptations into cash flows that required pressure to maintain. He leaned on public employees in ways that bleed trust from institutions. He skated on taxes that others had to pay. He brooked no competition he didn't authorize, and squeezed suppliers who refused to play by his rules. Those are real costs that ripple through neighborhoods in late fees, shut doors, and the slow corrosion of fairness. A complete telling has to include them. A complete telling also admits what made him hard for some to condemn. He played his part with a public-facing warmth that made ordinary people feel seen. They forgave him his sins because his sins arrived wrapped in jokes and dinners, and a promise that trouble would stay outside the door. That bargain is one city's keep making and unmaking in every generation. Some things you can count, and some you can only remember. The counts include arrests for gambling, conspiracy to keep an illegal betting place, liquor violations in the bootlegging years, and complaints that listed extortion among the charges. They include tax inquiries. They include the famous subpoena to sit under hot lights while a senator asked questions. The memories include the way he greeted a patrolman by name, the night he saw a waitress cry over a broken stove and solved it with an envelope, the way band leaders swore he listened to the music for its own sake, not just for the cover it gave a meeting in the back. That mix makes him a human figure, not a cardboard villain or a romanticized rogue. His story also shows the shape of organized life in that time. City economies didn't split cleanly into good and bad. They braided together in places like roadhouses, union halls, ward clubs, and barbershops. In that braid, a man who could collect favors and return them had more sway than a man who pushed. Willie understood that completely. It's why he rose so fast under Costello, who prized influence over noise. It's why he was welcome in Newark, while Zwillman built legitimate fronts. It's why Joe Adonis kept him close. And it's why, when the age of television made characters out of shadows, the quality that had lifted him became a danger no one around him was willing to tolerate. When entertainment turned his story into fiction in later years, they picked a single moment to symbolize his power. A contract unlocked by a conversation people didn't want to put in print. It's tidy and dramatic and irresistible. But the real reach of his life is better seen in smaller acts repeated every day. He made sure a bookmaker who got hit on Saturday had money on Monday. He arranged for a club to find a trumpet player on short notice when a band's car broke down. He moved envelopes between rooms with the efficiency of a post office and the discretion of a confessor. He spread his bets, spread his favors, and expected both to be returned. The city learned a lesson from how his story closed. Committees learned to expect that a little celebrity can spur the public to support reforms they'd otherwise ignore. Prosecutors learned to move faster while the spotlight is still on. Operators learned to keep talkers away from cameras and microphones. The lesson for citizens is older. A grin and a tip do not change the math of what a racket costs a town. They only make the bill easier to ignore. As for him, memory settles on that familiar smile and the way he owned a room. People who were young when he reigned grew old talking about him, the way grandparents talk about a neighborhood store that sold the best bread. The stories you hear on a park bench in Bergen County say as much about the tellers as about the subject. They like the way he made a city feel like a neighborhood. They shrug at the rest, or say the rest was the price of lively nights in a time that loved them. The map he drew with handshakes did not vanish when he did. It shifted, thinned in some places, thickened in others, and settled under quieter stewards who liked dim rooms and short sentences. Operators in Newark, Jersey City, Hoboken, and the river towns kept their calendars steady. Collections moved on Mondays, reconciliations on Wednesdays, payroll for bands on Fridays, the same rhythm that had made the nightlife hum in his day. What changed was tone. The new voices preferred fewer lunches, fewer jokes, and no cameras. They were students of the public lesson the country had just absorbed. Charm can be a liability when lawmen are buying new televisions and the press has learned the names on the evening shows. You can trace the handover in small notes buried in old files. A bookmaker who once met Willie at a diner now listed appointments with a man who answered to Jerry, another who signed receipts with an R and a flourish like a boot heel. Clerks in municipal buildings who used to count on a holiday ham from a certain friend learned to expect a card with a different signature. The cash still flowed through parlors and taverns that offered a sandwich with a side of odds. The numbers game still tugged coins from apron pockets and pay envelopes. The ledger that mattered most, the one that matched risk to revenue, remained open. Only the pen changed hands. Law enforcement tried to adjust in step. After the hearings, state houses talked about tools and tactics. Committees recommended tighter control of phone services that carried results from tracks to back rooms. Mayors promised to suspend liquor licenses when rooms doubled as betting shops, and then found themselves dodging calls from owners who reminded them that those rooms kept a neighborhood lively and safe. The words clean and reform rose in headlines. On the street, raids hit small places first, because small places had doors easy to push. Officers posed over seized racing forms and a few phones, made the front page, and returned next week to do the same 2 blocks over. The appetite for wagers did not bend with a press conference. The operators who replaced Willie counted on that fact, like sunrise. His name stayed in the air anyway. Neighbors told stories that began with "you remember when?" and reached back to Prohibition nights, when a young man with more nerve than years navigated liquor cases through back alleys. They recalled the way he pivoted when repeal came, sliding into wagering with the same talent for coordination. His criminal ledger has been tallied many times because the items are familiar. Bootlegging violations in the 1000s, 920s, and early 1030s, cases tied to transportation and storage. Gambling cases in the years after, charging conspiracy to keep a common betting place, maintaining a wire room, and collecting on sports wagers. Numbers rackets that turned every day into a drawing. Extortion claims framed as insurance for bars and clubs that wanted quiet. Slot machines pushed into diners and taverns when the heat was low and whisked to storage when a new chief promised a cleanup. Short-term loans that came with firm deadlines and premium costs. Tax inquiries built on the gap between spending and declared income. The pattern was common in that world, and he was good at it. He did not stand out for novelty. He stood out because he ran the system with sociable grace. Entertainers kept his memory in a softer light. The rustic cabin in Englewood Cliffs and other North Jersey rooms that mixed supper with swing had felt like his parlor. Younger singers had stepped to microphones there hoping a radio audience would hear. Older band leaders had counted stacks after a good weekend and sent a drink to the man who made the booking possible. The old tale about the crooner who needed a contract unlocked traveled with any conversation about Willie. The elements never sat still. Some versions told of a threatened bandleader. Others insisted persuasion did the trick, and a token release fee gave everyone a story polite enough to repeat. Biographers and reporters who dug into it found edges but no courtroom proof. The singer himself rejected the rougher strip of lore. The honest note in that chorus is simple. Willie moved in the rooms where that decision was made. He liked to help talent he believed in, and voices with gravitas have long said he used his influence to nudge the change that made a career take flight. His public performance before the Senate committee kept echoing through the 50s. The hearings had done two things at once. They lifted him into living rooms and turned him into a character people felt they knew. They also painted a target on his back in a world that demanded silence. When friends later told reporters that his last year grew tense, they were describing that tug-of-war between the public's appetite for a show and the private need for order. When the lunch ended badly, no one inside his circle claimed surprise, at least not in whispers. The code was clear, even if the law books did not record it. Those who spoke too freely about business were liabilities. He had spoken too freely, even if he thought the lines he offered were harmless. Meanwhile, leadership around him kept moving. Frank Costello's calm stewardship of his New York organization lasted a few more years until a stairway scare in 1957 nudged him into the background. Vito Genovese stepped up and then fell to a federal case that ended with a long term. Joe Adonis left the United States after immigration pressure mounted, settling in Italy and leaving behind a reputation for polish and profit. Newark's Abner "Longy" Zwillman tried to keep one foot in respectability through legitimate fronts. His death in 1959 ended a long run and fueled a new set of rumors that still follow his name. In New Jersey proper, Gerardo Jerry Catena and Ruggiero the Boot, Boiardo consolidated one preferring meetings that felt like boardrooms, the other running a neighborhood like a private borough and keeping it disciplined. Willie would have recognized the architecture even if he would have missed the warmth. If you want to understand the mechanics of the gambling world he tended, picture a city after dark when shops are closing, but certain doors stay welcoming. A phone on a back shelf rings with a coded phrase that tells the room the next race results are in. A clerk pencils changes on a board and calls a partner 2 towns over to lay off a chunk of risk. A runner drops a small envelope with number slips collected from a barber, a grocer, a tailor, and a bartender. Later in the week, a collector pays winners and marks new balances in a book with initials, not names. None of this is romantic. It is repetitive, precise, and designed to keep cash moving and tempers cool. He specialized in smoothing the edges. When a bettor tried to welch or a clerk came up short, he arranged a talk, set terms, and sent everyone away with a plan instead of a scene. That approach kept police attention manageable for a long time because order looks, from the sidewalk, a lot like legitimacy. The tax part of the story tends to get less attention because it lacks glamour, but it mattered. Revenue agents, spurred by success against other figures, looked hard at his lifestyle. He drove good cars, ate well, and took friends to rooms where a band cost money. His returns did not explain all of it. Interviews and contemporaneous notes suggest that the feds tried to pressure him into a mistake on paper, since they could not lock him to a desk in a wire room. He responded like many in his position. He kept assets in relatives' names, used cash, and borrowed from friends when he wanted something big enough to be noticed. You can hear his voice when a question came about income sources. He'd say he did all right at the track, a line delivered with a grin that turned math into comedy for a second. Agents do not laugh for long. That strategy worked only until a target lost the room's goodwill. He kept the room for years, then the air changed. His way of dealing with police jokes, first names, coffee bought before anyone reached for a wallet tells you how cities worked then. Officers patrolling the same beats daily knew the store owners, the waiters, the men who stood in doorways. They also knew which rooms to leave alone unless the chief needed a raid for the paper. Willie's approach played into that culture. He treated lawmen as neighbors and expected the same in return. That never meant immunity. It meant the difference between a door kicked in and a nod that said, "Not tonight." After the hearings, the nods were harder to get. Chiefs felt the cameras. Captains felt the memos. Patrolmen felt the tone. He kept trying to soothe it with food and charm. He never truly believed that a smile would stop working. He came from a world where a smile solved half of life. In the months after his funeral, people who owed him money paid his estate as they could. Debts inside his web were settled not only because books had to balance, but because reputation matters even after a man is gone. The new stewards watched who paid on time and who stalled. That quiet accounting determined who kept routes and who found their phones ringing less. Bookmakers who thought his departure would loosen restraints learned the opposite. Without a talkative peacemaker mediating, the rules tightened. The message from upstairs was unmistakable. Order, not personality, would govern. In that sense, his death marked a cultural pivot inside the same lines he had drawn. The business became less public, more managerial. In popular culture, a new shorthand took hold. Writers and directors looking for a single scene to explain underworld influence on entertainment borrowed the rumor with the biggest hook. A crooner struggling under a contract visits a band leader with friends who do not smile. Papers are signed, and a star is born. Anyone who saw the film version years later could not miss the echo. That art drew on real whispers. It also simplified everything Willie had been into one dramatic moment. He was more complicated than that. He was a broker who loved rooms where music softened the edges of negotiation. He preferred deals that left everyone standing. He built his reach in increments, not threats, and invested in people as much as in rackets, because people remember kindness longer than they remember a price. His legal trail, even after the end, offers a map of what he did. Dockets from the 1930s list liquor violations. Early 1940s through 1950, one list gambling conspiracies, maintaining betting, places, numbers, operations, and, in some instances, extortion charges tied to protection. There are also repeated notes of arrests, where cases collapsed because warrants were challenged, or evidence lacked the clean chain of custody that prosecutors need. He was not singular in that respect. Many operators in that age lived in the gap between public suspicion and prosecutable proof. He knew where the gap widened and how to stand in it without slipping. He had weak spots. The most obvious was the one everyone saw on television, a love of the stage that overrode caution. The other, discussed mostly in whispers during his last stretch, was health. Friends spoke to reporters and historians about a diagnosis that, left to advance, can unsettle judgment and make a careful man loose with words. No public medical file closes that question, but the belief mattered more than the fact. In his world, perception drives action. If important people think you can no longer keep the code, they act to protect the code. The lunch that felt like 100 others turned into a final meeting under that logic. His family went back to lives away from headlines. Houses that had been lively with visitors fell quiet. A few regulars kept stopping by in the months after, more out of habit and respect than out of business need. The kids who had gotten uniforms because he paid for them aged into men who told their children about a neighbor with a big grin and a bigger tip for a busboy trying to make rent. The aura of a local figure fades in time, but the stories he leaves in other people's mouths do not vanish as quickly. In Bergen and Hudson County, you can still meet people who will lean back and talk about a man who greeted everyone and seemed to carry summer with him into winter rooms. There is a civic lesson hidden in the way his story spread. Neighborhoods accepted his arrangements because the arrangements delivered something they wanted: lively nights without chaos, easy credit for club owners, a feeling that disputes could be fixed without a scene. Those benefits came with costs that took longer to see. Skewed markets, public servants bent toward private favor, a habit of looking away from the law when it was inconvenient. The end of his story snapped some eyes open. It reminded people that the calm they prized depended on rules enforced outside any court. It taught officials that public attention can be harnessed to pass good laws if they move while the subject is still on page 1. It taught the underworld that anyone who enjoys a spotlight becomes a risk, and risks are not left to ripen. It also left a trail for historians and curious readers. FBI files compiled over decades mention him in connection with associates who later filled books of their own. Senate transcripts preserve the odd cadence of his answers, the way he turned a question into an excuse to flirt with an audience and puncture a solemn mood. City newspapers from the 1930s to 1951 show the steady beat of raids, cases, and outcomes that defined his working life. When those papers published his obituary, the writing often took on the shape you've heard here. A double portrait of a friendly neighbor, and a rackets boss who kept the night's machinery in tune. Some would like to reduce that portrait to a moral charm can't save you from the code, or crime doesn't pay. The truth is messier and more instructive. Charm is a tool, not a shield. It can open doors, buy goodwill, and keep tempers cool. It cannot change a rule book designed to keep revenue safe. As for crime paying, it did for a while. It paid for cars, dinners, loans to friends, stipends for families who needed a hand. It also exacted a bill at the end, and it passed costs to neighbors who didn't ask to be part of the math. He knew both sides. He played the game with eyes open and accepted risk as the price for being the man in the middle. By the mid-50s, his name had become part of the background story of a region that kept reinventing how to navigate appetite and order. Appalachian in 1,957 scattered men in suits across snowy fields and exposed a council that had preferred anonymity for 3 decades. Federal laws in the early 1960s reached across state lines to choke the wires that fed bookmakers. Those developments came after Willie, but they moved the world he once managed further from the stage where he'd felt at home. Operators who inherited his routes learned to keep their heads down, talk less, and act like businessmen who happened to accept cash in envelopes. The clubs kept their lights soft and their tablecloths crisp, but the stories got quieter. In rooms where his laugh used to carry above the clink of glasses, people spoke of him in the sideways way that keeps memory safe. A nod, a line about how he treated the staff, a mention that he could get you a trumpet player at noon for an 8 o'clock show. Even as New Jersey settled under new hands, his name hovered like the scent of cigars in wood faint, familiar, and tied to nights when the band hit its stride and everyone in the room felt like part of a private celebration. The hearing that made him famous lived on in reruns, shown to school groups and civic clubs as a lesson about sunlight. People remembered the grin, the quick answers, the way he flicked tension off the table like a crumb. If you read the transcripts, the pattern is there. He gave just enough to seem open, swerved when a name threatened to drag someone else into the glow, and wrapped refusals in a joke that let the audience breathe. The committee wanted a map. He sketched a smile. That showmanship felt harmless to him. To colleagues, it was a leak you couldn't plug. In a trade where silence is the only reliable guardrail, charm can be a loose wheel. He had always preferred persuasion to force. When a tavern owner balked at paying for quiet, he sent a man with a calm voice and a ledger, not a temper. The pitch was practical. A weekly fee buys peace. In law books, that was extortion. On the ground, it was called insurance by everyone who used it. He kept wire rooms tidy, taught clerks to keep slips in order, spread risk by laying off bets across town lines, and insisted on payouts that arrived fast enough to keep trust intact. He ran numbers as a steady ritual coins gathered at noon. A drawing late in the day, small wins paid promptly so the game felt honest even when the odds were not. He rented floor space for slot machines when a chief's promises of a sweep faded, then boxed them up when a new chief arrived with cameras. He offered short-term loans to owners whose weeks ran long, charged rates that reflected the risk, and expected schedules to be kept. He greased municipal gears with donations and favors, knowing the return would be a call returned or a deadline quietly extended. He faced tax questions whenever his spending outpaced his declared income, and treated those questions like whether endurable, inconvenient, and never permanent. These were crimes, and he committed them. They made money because people wanted what he sold, even when the law said they shouldn't. He rationalized that he provided order around appetites that would exist with or without him. He told himself that his methods, meetings, deals, and calendars kept trouble down. The ledger balances a different way when you step outside his circle. Debts tied to wagers can chew through family budgets. Quiet payments to stay open are a tax on honest competition. Favors traded with officials tilt the floor beneath ordinary citizens. He built a friendly empire on those skews, and he wore his friendliness like a suit he never took off. His ties ran up and across. He answered to the New York organization that Frank Costello guided with a politician's patience. He coordinated with Newark's Abner Longies Willman, who layered legitimate fronts over older hustles and made influence look like business. He treated Joe Adonis as close kin in Everything But the Parting, family album. Their names paired in police memos whenever North Jersey's movers were listed. He worked alongside men who later became the next chapter's managers, notably Gerardo, Jerry Catena, and Ruggiero, Richie the Boot. Boiardo, each with his own style, one serene and boardroom calm, the other territorial and unmistakably present. Titles come and go in this world. Function tells you who matters. When money needed a route, he drew it. When rivals bristled, he set a table. When a club faced a slow month, he found a draw. Entertainers talked about him as a patron with a good ear. He liked standards and swing, loved a singer who could float a note over a room, and kept an eye on crowds, as if applause were a ledger line. The story that refuses to die, the one about the Hoboken kid, and the contract that had to be unlocked, belongs here. Reporters, biographers, and sworn statements in later proceedings say he took an interest when the singer's path narrowed, that he wanted the kid on a bigger stage and helped arrange the move. Some versions recall a token payment attached to the release. Some add pressure that stayed just short of a threat. Others insist it was persuasion and promise alone. The singer denied being pushed. Courts never certified the harsher tale. What remains consistent across credible voices is that Willie moved in the offices where that decision matured, and that his phone calls carried weight. That influence strengthened his legend, and later gave fiction an irresistible scene to borrow. It also showed his preferred method. Doors opened with conversations, not crashes. After his death, the network he attended tightened rather than frayed. New leaders cut back the public circuit. Lunches turned into brief appointments. Reporters found fewer quotes worth printing. Bookmaking continued with the same efficiency he had prized. But the faces at the center stepped back into the shadows. Police raids kept scooping up clerks and phones. Numbers bankers still ran drawings in apartments with curtains closed and radios low. Money moved on a known schedule. The difference was taste. The visible personality who had once smoothed every knot was gone, and the people who replaced him treated charisma like a risk factor. Lawmen learned from him too. The hearings had shown that a camera can change the country's mind, so agencies leaned into public cases that dramatized scale. They pushed for laws that helped squeeze the lines between a wire room and a racetrack's results. They made it easier to yank the license of a bar that doubled as a betting office. They pressed utility companies for records when a small storefront lit up the phone grid at odd hours. They chased tax gaps with greater patience. Progress rarely came as fast as headlines promised, but the shape of the chase changed. If he had lived another decade, he would have found the operating space smaller and the costs higher. You can still walk the streets where he worked and see where the seams lay. Old diners that once hosted reconciliations now host families on Sunday mornings. The rooms that ran phones and chalkboards have become salons or boutiques, with soft music on the speakers. A bartender who saved his first nickel slips for the numbers game became a store owner with bright windows. People tell you that the city feels different now in ways they like and ways they don't. Safer, cleaner, more predictable. Also less neighborly, less willing to bend rules for the sake of a night that feels like a secret. That second piece was his specialty. He gave ordinary people a sense that the city would notice them. He did it by weaving them into a web he controlled, and that is the paradox that shadows his memory. The old complaint that he made municipal life crooked is true. He used generosity to buy access and pliancy to keep it. The old compliment that he made neighborhoods feel looked after is also true. He knew the names of cops' kids and busboys' mothers, and the bartender's brother who needed a job. He listened to a band's rehearsal, as if the horn line mattered to him personally. He enjoyed being the man who could fix a problem with a phone call. It's worth saying again because it explains why people who knew better still liked him. He was present. And presence is a powerful currency in a place built on speed and exchanges. An overlooked chapter in his history is the way he managed disputes among the city's small lenders. When a bar owner owed two different men, he would step in and set a plan that kept the bar open and both lenders patient. He squared tips between crews that shared blocks. He helped steady the flow of jukebox and vending routes, those coin-operated corners of the economy that kept cash jangling. These weren't headlines, they were chores. He liked chores because they kept the machine from rattling. If he got a cut for the service, and he did, he saw it as a fee for keeping the show going. He also understood publicity long before television. He posed at charity dinners where no one asked where the extra envelope came from. He bought tables at banquets and made sure the mayor's aide and the precinct captain ended up 2 seats apart with him in the middle. He donated to churches and lodges where the sermons and speeches rang with civic pride. He underwrote uniforms for kids who sent him holiday cards that survived in drawers long after the sender forgot the reason. Those gestures didn't cancel the harm in his rackets. They made the harm easier for people to ignore. That's not absolution, it's diagnosis. By the mid-1950s, a larger shuffle was on. The Appalachian meeting in 1,957 scattered leaders across snowy lawns and newspapers, confirming for the 1,000th time what everyone already knew. The network existed and met like any industry to divide markets and soothe quarrels. Willie would have hated that visibility. He thrived on a city's tolerance for what it half saw. His successors adapted to a world where half-seeing wasn't enough to keep the law at bay. They killed the public circuit, favored private rooms, and taught their crews that the best headline is no headline. If his life has a moral for people who work in shadows, that's the one. Don't smile for a camera that can't understand your rulebook. Even so, his image survived as a kind of local archetype. The sociable broker who made money by making nights smoother, who knew the staff and the stars, who thought a quip could win an argument that numbers and rules had already decided. Older folks at corner tables still say his name as a synonym for a certain kind of city charm. They aren't defending what he did. They're remembering the feeling he curated, welcomed at the door, looked after at your table, and sent home believing the city and you had an understanding. He sold that feeling with skill, and people bought it. In the archives, you'll find enough paper to anchor the story. Arrest logs that start with bootlegging charges in the 1920s, move through liquor transport and storage cases, then shift to gambling conspiracies, maintaining betting places, and numbers banks. Extortion complaints in which bar owners used phrases like weekly security and keeping the peace that the law rewrote as coercion for money. Tax case memos that puzzled over cars, dinners, and travel, not fully explained by ink on returns. Senate transcripts where his cadence skates along until a lawyer's hand on his sleeve pulls him back. News clippings showing his face above a caption that alternates between rogue and host. What you don't find is a neat finale in a courtroom, because his end came in a dining room where court rules didn't apply. Spend a few minutes with the musician's stories and you'll hear the parts of him that don't fit neatly into a file. A sax player remembers a tip that kept him from pawning his horn. A band leader remembers a quiet talk in which a debt got reshaped so the band could finish the season. An MC remembers an NT, introduction, that led to a better gig 3 towns over. None of these small rescues required crime, but they were tangled with it, funded by it, and returned as loyalty when he needed a favor at the door or a night with extra bodies in chairs to make a club look prosperous. He understood that goodwill is interest-bearing. He collected with a smile. He never pretended to be anything other than what he was. When pressed by officials about his income, he leaned into the role of a man who bet on horses and liked restaurants. When lectured about morality, he nodded, paid his fines, and made his next reservation. He never wrote a manifesto. He wrote the city into his daily schedule. That habit is why, decades later, his story still feels like a walking tour of a region's past. Roadhouses with radios, diners where cops and bookmakers shared the counter, barbershops where numbers were written on paper so thin it curled when you exhaled, and back rooms where a handshake ended a quarrel that had been building for weeks. The story doesn't end at the corner table where he took his last lunch. It keeps drifting through neighborhoods in small conversations, in the way older folks wave at a storefront that used to be a club, in the way a song from a bandstand can lift memory like the smell of bread from a long-gone bakery. In those moments, people talk about a man who stood at the line where the city's public face met its after-hours soul. A man who made friends faster than most, and turned favors into a living. They remember a grin, a coat slung just right, and the habit of paying the check before anyone else noticed the waiter. He came to America as a kid from Italy and learned early how to fit himself into crowded streets with too few chances. Tenements taught him to read a room before he could read a book. He knew that names mattered, that a helpful errand could become a door, that small debts repaid on time grew into protection that wasn't written down. When the country banned liquor, he found opportunity in the same way thousands of young men did, by moving bottles to people who still wanted a drink. Arrest cards from that stretch tell of seizures, fines, and charges tied to transport and storage. He learned the map behind the map alleys, barns, basements, and built a list of allies who liked the way he kept things smooth. With repeal, he didn't fold. He shifted to gambling, where the law still frowned but customers lined up. He built wire rooms in backspaces that looked innocent from the sidewalk, kept clerks steady, spread risk with layoff bets, and treated payouts like a promise that couldn't be broken if you wanted repeat business. Complaints from those years used the same phrases again and again. Conspiracy to keep a common gambling place, maintaining a betting room, collecting on sports wagers. Add in the numbers game that braided through working neighborhoods, a daily ritual of coins and hope, and you see the backbone of his income. Layer on insurance for taverns and roadhouses, the weekly envelope that the law called extortion and he called peacekeeping. Mix in slot machines that came and went with the heat. Finish with short-term loans tied to firm dates. The picture is not mysterious. It's a catalog of illegal enterprises that paid because he kept them organized and pleasant. He also wove himself into show business because the clubs that hosted wagers also hosted music. He liked to watch a singer make a room quieter with one long note. He liked a band that could turn dinner into a celebration. He loaned money to get through a thin week and expected it back after a thick one. He booked acts for owners who needed a draw. The most famous story attached to his name belongs to that overlap, the tale that he helped free a young Hoboken singer from a contract that had become a cage. Versions differ. Some picture pressure that stopped short of menace. Some picture a meeting that ended with a token payment and a handshake. The singer denied being pushed. Courts never ruled on it. What can be said from credible accounts is that Willie's phone calls mattered, that he stood near the decision, and that the singer stepped into a bigger life soon after. His reach grew under Frank Costello's influence. With Lucky Luciano out of the country in the mid-1940s, Costello ran his New York organization like a patient politician, and New Jersey was part of that world. Many reports place Willie as Costello's top hand across the river, the voice who balanced Newark's interests with New York's needs, the person who kept arguments from curdling into trouble. He met with Abner Longies Willman, Newark's businessman boss, more than once, traded jokes with Joe Adonis, and kept lines open to the crews who ran pieces of Jersey's cities. Titles mattered less than results, and the results were clear. Betting stayed reliable, clubs stayed open, collectors stayed busy, and envelopes arrived on time. The Kefauver hearings disrupted that balance. Television turned private habits into a national discussion. He sat under bright lights, answered more questions than most men in his shoes, and charmed millions who had never heard his name. That performance entertained the country and upset the people who relied on secrecy. Add in persistent whispers that his health had declined in a way that loosened self-control, a rumor often framed as advanced syphilis affecting judgment, never confirmed in public records. And you have the equation that governed his final months. He kept speaking in public rooms. He kept greeting reporters with a wink. He kept traveling the same circuits. The code he had served drew a line he didn't see until it was too late. He was killed at lunch in early October 1951 in Cliffside Park, a town where he felt at home. The case left no names on a verdict form, but the logic hardened fast. His own side made a decision to protect its quiet. The city absorbed the event with a mixture of shock and resignation that tells you how things worked then. Clubs paused for a breath and reopened. Bookmakers found new hands to deliver envelopes. Police held press conferences, and detectives filled binders. The absence was personal in dining rooms. It was structural in boardrooms that didn't advertise their meetings. The function he had performed keeping the machine steady moved to men who preferred darkness. After he was gone, Gerardo, Jerry, Katina, and Ruggiero, Richie the Boot. Boiardo took more visible control of the pieces he used to coordinate. Katina kept a quiet profile and a firm voice in rooms where numbers mattered. Boyardo ran Newark with the local certainty of a man who knows every block. Their approach aligned with the lesson of the hearings: talk less, keep lunches short, let no one become a public figure. Across the river, Costello tried to maintain calm until 1957, when a shot on a staircase convinced him to retire. Vito Genovese stepped forward and soon after fell to a federal narcotics case. Joe Adonis, under immigration pressure, left for Italy. Longis Willman, who dressed his power in business suits, died in 1959 under circumstances that prompt debate to this day. The era's second act turned away from personalities that drew cameras. Law enforcement adjusted too. Public hearings had shown that national attention could help pass laws. States gave themselves stronger tools to yank liquor licenses from places that doubled as betting rooms. Investigators learned to trace phone traffic from tracks to storefronts. Tax cases grew more patient and less theatrical. By the early 1960s, federal legislation tightened the lines that fed bookmakers and made interstate wagering riskier. None of that erased the appetite that sustained his business, but it narrowed the lanes he had driven with ease. What, finally, are the facts a listener should carry after the music fades? He committed crimes for decades and made a fortune by organizing them in a way that felt, to his neighborhoods, more like service than threat. He ran bookmaking, numbers, and insurance for bars. He moved slot machines in and out with the weather. He built influence with cash, favors, and attention to detail. He helped himself to credit he didn't report and treated tax questions like a nuisance. He held the ear of entertainers and, according to many credible voices, aided a singer's leap into fame. He did all of this while pretending that the law was a kind of seasonal storm you could wait out with coffee and patience. He also gave money to families that needed help, paid for uniforms, and made nights feel safe for patrons who just wanted a show. Those truths sit together even if they don't reconcile. He worked by smoothing conflict. A club owner behind on payments found a plan instead of a wrecked door. Two bettors fighting over a debt left with a schedule and a handshake. A numbers banker short on cash got a loan and a warning to fix his books. He kept public servants close enough to answer the phone, far enough to deny any tie. Those methods limited trouble for years. They also relied on a quiet that he eventually broke on television. When he turned the code into a performance, the same smile that had opened doors began to look like a risk the people behind those doors couldn't afford. Memory does a strange thing with figures like him. Neighbors tell stories that close with a punchline and a warm glance at the ceiling, as if he might walk in and order for the table. Historians pull together arrest sheets and transcripts and see a pattern of law-breaking so regular it becomes a profession. Artists borrow the best rumor and turn it into a scene that stands in for 1,000 conversations we'll never hear. The truth is not a scene. It's a long, steady hum of small acts that made a city's unofficial economy run. He excelled at that hum until the pitch drifted. One lasting legacy he left is cautionary. If you make your living in a world that insists on silence, don't mistake applause for permission. If you build an empire on favors, remember that favors are not laws. They evaporate when wind changes. If you trade on warmth, accept that warmth cannot protect you from rules written by men who measure risk with cold eyes. He knew these things in his bones. But near the end, he believed charm could outrun them. That belief paid for a while. It failed at a daytime table in a bright room. There is also a civic lesson. Cities that enjoy convenience without asking who supplies it end up borrowing trouble. People wanted wagers without books, thrills without paperwork, and protection without forms. Men like him stepped into that gap and sold solutions. The bill came due in corruption, pressure on small businesses, and trust drained from public offices. Admiring his hospitality should not hide that cost. Condemning his crimes should not erase the parts of his nature that made him beloved in rooms where he showed up with kindness. A full picture holds both. If you walk those river towns today, you can still feel him as a presence in ritual. The way a bartender sets a glass on a coaster with a slight flourish. The way an owner greets a regular by name at the door. The way a band leader checks the room before counting off a tune. He didn't invent those gestures. He amplified them, attached them to a system, and made them pay. The system changed names and hands. The Jesters stayed because they're older than any racket and kinder than any ledger. He is sometimes reduced to a line in a later film's dialogue, to a rumor about a $1 contract, to a newsreel of a man who turned a stern hearing into a lounge act. He was more than those slices. He was a connector across two worlds that needed each other more than they admitted. Nightlife and the machine that kept nightlife safe for paying customers. He kept that peace with rules of his own, some helpful, some harmful, most profitable for him. When those rules collided with a newer world that prized disclosure, he lost his footing. Think of him as a mirror of his time. The immigrant grind, the bootleg hustle, the turn toward wagers, introductions, and protections sold as calm, the mixing of show business with backroom business, the habit of treating official frowns as background noise, the sudden power of television to change reputations overnight, the rigid code inside his circle that didn't bend for charm. Every point on that line tells you as much about the country as it does about Willie. However you weigh him, rogue, neighbor, boss, host, one scene deserves to be the last in your mind. Not the lunch that closed the book, but a simpler night years earlier in a North Jersey club, with a band lifting a standard into the room. He's at his table, greeting a cop, a councilman, a singer, a busboy, and a bookmaker, as if they all belong at the same party. He waves at the bandstand, listens for the high note, and smiles when it lands. He believes this is what he was built to do, keep 100 different moods in harmony for as long as the set lasts. That, more than any single rumor or headline, is the thread that explains how he lived, and why his name still lingers when the lights dim and the last song fades. Thanks for staying with me. As the last notes fade, remember Willie Moretti as he was, a charming fixer in a complicated time, lifting singers, smoothing quarrels, and working the shadows. His grin opened doors, consequences closed them. Let that history drift like distant traffic on the Hudson while you sink into rest. May your dreams be calm, your room warm, and tomorrow kind. Sleep well, take care of each other, and good night.